All right, so today we're diving into this situation with U.S. aid to Ukraine. Things are changing really quickly, and there's a lot to untangle. So we've got some excerpts from a news article called "U.S. pauses aid to Ukraine amidst rising tensions."
Yeah, this is a big deal. I mean, this aid freeze, it's not just some symbolic gesture. It really disrupts this long-standing strategy of trying to contain Russia. And, it has the potential to embolden them not just in that region, but beyond.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So this article, it really dives into this heated Oval Office meeting
Right.
between President Trump and President Zelensky. What exactly happened there?
Well, it seems like this meeting was a real turning point. The article describes this palpable tension
Mhm.
between Trump and Zelensky. Even Vice President Vance was there. And Trump, he publicly criticized Zelensky, demanded an apology, accused him of not really wanting peace.
But Zelensky's message, it seemed to be about collaboration, right?
Yeah, exactly. His public statements emphasized the need for peace. And a united front with both the U.S. and Europe, he's been really highlighting Ukraine's efforts to work with allies towards a peaceful resolution.
So it sounds like a pretty big disconnect. And then in the middle of all this, Trump decides to hit pause on military aid to Ukraine. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Well, this aid package, it includes some really crucial military equipment. We're talking artillery, anti-tank weapons, rockets, armored vehicles. This is the kind of support that has been so vital in bolstering Ukraine's defense against Russia.
So what happens now to Ukraine's defense capabilities? I mean, is this like a gift to Putin, as some people are saying?
Well, some definitely see it that way. Others argue that it's a strategic move by Trump, maybe to force Europe to take on more responsibility for its own security. It's a risky gamble, but it's one that Trump might be betting on.
Yeah, it's definitely a high-stakes move, huge implications.
Yeah.
And what's the international community's take on all this?
European leaders are definitely watching closely. They've been working on a peace plan, showing strong support for Ukraine. Figures like Keir Starmer are calling for increased involvement from Britain to ensure European security. There's even talk of a coalition of the willing to deploy peacekeepers.
But without the U.S., how effective can any of those initiatives be? The U.S. has been such a key player in this conflict, financially and militarily.
That's the big question. Their absence could really undermine peace efforts. And this kind of brings us to another layer of this story. The proposed deal granting the U.S. access to Ukraine's rare earth metals.
Right, this deal. Why are these metals such a big deal?
Well, these metals are essential for high-tech industries, smartphones, defense systems. And this makes Ukraine a strategically valuable partner, especially in this global technology race, where the U.S. is trying to maintain an edge.
So this deal was meant to sweeten the pot for a future peace agreement, offer economic incentives for the U.S. to be invested in Ukraine's stability long term. But then this Oval Office clash happened, and it feels like things got messy.
Exactly. Zelensky is seeking security guarantees against Russian aggression as part of this metals deal. But Trump's public messaging suggests he's skeptical of those traditional security guarantees. His focus seems to be on those economic interests, and that's creating a serious impasse.
But isn't this metals deal contingent on a peaceful resolution? How likely is that, given the current level of tension? Especially with Trump publicly blasting Zelensky on social media.
Well, Trump's approach is certainly unprecedented, publicly criticizing a world leader in that way. It really undermines diplomatic efforts, and it potentially signals to other leaders that public shaming is now part of U.S. foreign policy. It makes predicting the likelihood of a peaceful resolution even more difficult.
And where does Vice President Vance fit into all of this? Does he agree with Trump's approach?
Vance seems to be more focused on the potential of the metals deal. He views it as the most effective path to lasting peace, arguing that those economic incentives for the U.S. provide a stronger guarantee than traditional military deployments.
So we've got clashing viewpoints, a paused aid package, this potentially valuable metals deal hanging in the balance, and the possibility of a major power shift in the region. It's a lot to unpack.
It definitely highlights the complexity of international relations, and this power dynamic is also playing out domestically. Trump's decision to freeze the aid could lead to a confrontation with Republicans in Congress, the ones who originally approved the funding.
So there could be some political fireworks on the horizon as well. What does all this mean for the future of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship and the conflict itself?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
While we can't predict the future, the situation is undeniably tense. This U.S. aid freeze represents a major shift in foreign policy, and the fallout from that Oval Office meeting has strained relations, creating a lot of uncertainty for everyone involved.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at some kind of crossroads. This aid freeze has sent shockwaves through the international community. And it seems like everyone's trying to figure out what's next.
It's a pivotal moment for U.S.-Ukraine relations for sure. And I think beyond that, this situation could reshape the world order as we know it.
Okay, so how does this impact the global landscape? How do you think other world powers are reacting to this shift in U.S. policy?
Imagine it like a high-stakes poker game. Everyone's watching to see who makes the next move, trying to read each other's bluffs. This aid freeze, it's not just about the money and the weapons. It's about alliances trust the perception of American power.
So you're saying this could impact how the U.S. is viewed, both by its allies and adversaries.
Exactly. America's reliability as a partner is being scrutinized. I mean, for example, how might China respond to this perceived power vacuum? Will they see it as an opportunity to increase their influence in the region?
That's a really interesting question. And what about Europe? If the U.S. is stepping back, will European countries have to rethink their reliance on the U.S. for security?
It's definitely possible. If the U.S. is seen as an unreliable partner, it could push European countries to look for other alliances, or even strengthen their own defenses.
So this whole situation could actually lead to a more independent and assertive Europe.
It's one potential outcome. Or it could lead to closer cooperation among European nations as they realize they need to pool resources and coordinate their efforts.
It's fascinating how these events could have such huge consequences. Yeah, it makes you wonder if things could have gone differently. If that Oval Office meeting hadn't been so bad. What if there had been more open dialogue, less finger-pointing?
It's hard not to speculate. That meeting really seems to have exposed the underlying tensions and differing priorities between Trump and Zelensky, and it seems to have set this whole chain of events in motion.
And neither leader seems to be backing down. Trump wants an apology while Zelensky insists he didn't do anything wrong. Is there any room for compromise here? Can this relationship be repaired?
That's the big question, isn't it? The damage from that Oval Office meeting and the aid freeze, it's going to be tough to repair. Rebuilding trust takes time and effort from both sides.
And what about Ukraine? Where does all this leave them?
Ukraine's in a really tough spot, caught in the middle of this geopolitical power struggle. Their fate's kind of hanging in the balance.
It's a good reminder that while we're analyzing the politics and the economics, this conflict has a very real human cost. Real people are being affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. Behind the headlines and the policy debates, there are individuals and families whose lives are being turned upside down. We can't forget that.
So taking a step back, what are some potential scenarios from here? What's the best case and worst case?
Well, in the worst case scenario, the tensions continue to escalate, leading to a further breakdown in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship and emboldening Russia even more. That could lead to a deepening of the conflict, with devastating consequences for Ukraine.
With a pretty grim picture. What about a more positive outcome? Is there a way to de-escalate things?
Of course, there's always hope. Cooler heads could prevail and we could see a diplomatic solution, maybe a compromise on the metals deal, or a new framework for security guarantees.
That'd be great. But it seems like there's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt first.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the U.S. and Ukraine. The U.S. needs to reassure its allies, too, that it's still a dependable partner. This situation has raised some doubts about U.S. commitments on the world stage.
You know, this whole situation makes me think of that saying, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone's scrambling to figure out what being prepared even means in this new uncertain world.
That's a good analogy. It really shows how complex international diplomacy can be. Every action has a reaction, and the ripple effects can be huge.
This aid freeze, it really feels like a turning point. It wasn't that long ago that things felt relatively stable, and now we're talking about potential power vacuum shifting alliances and a very real possibility of the conflict escalating.
It highlights how fragile the balance of power can be. Seemingly small events can trigger a domino effect, reshaping the whole geopolitical landscape.
It feels like we're all standing on shifting sand, trying to find our footing in this new reality.
And the choices that leaders make in the coming days and weeks will determine whether we sink or find solid ground.
Yeah, it makes you think, what does all this mean for the future? Like, how do countries interact with each other? Are we heading to a place where alliances aren't so solid and the traditional power structures are being challenged?
I think it's really interesting because we might be in this weird in-between time. The old rules, they don't seem to apply anymore, and all the players are changing their game plan.
So it's like that high-stakes poker game you mentioned, where everyone's trying to guess what the other person will do.
Yeah, exactly. And whoever wins this game could seriously change the balance of power globally. Like, What if the U.S. steps back from being the world leader? Will other countries like China or Russia jump in to take their place?
It's like a game of musical chairs with really high stakes.
That's a great way to think about it. And the stakes are super high, especially for countries like Ukraine. They're caught in the middle of this whole power struggle.
It's a reminder that while we talk about these big global events, they actually affect real people's lives.
You're right. We can't forget about the human cost of all this. The decisions that leaders make, they have a real impact on regular people.
This deep dive has really shown how important it is to have level-headed leaders in these crazy times.
It's a time for smart diplomacy, for leaders who really get how complicated things are and understand the impact of their actions.
And it's important for people to be informed and get involved, to ask tough questions and hold their leaders accountable.
Yeah, because the choices made today will create the world we live in tomorrow.
Well, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We covered the clash in the Oval Office, the U.S. stopping aid, the possible fallout for Ukraine, and what it all means for the world.
It's complicated and things are changing all the time. We'll keep a close eye on it.
Thanks for joining us as we explored this global crisis. We hope you found this deep dive helpful and something to think about.
And we encourage you to stay informed, stay curious, and look for different viewpoints.
Because, like we've seen, the stakes couldn't be higher.